Welcome to the lecture Azure Subscription Overview. At high level, it is easy to understand the role of subscription on Azure Horizon, as its name unfolds the meaning. However, as we dive deep onto Azure subscription, we realize how Microsoft has molded enterprise features and governance into it. Let's learn the Azure subscription in depth and its role in cloud computing with Microsoft Azure. Microsoft Azure is represented by a portfolio of services which includes virtual machine, storage, network, machine learning, and orchestrations, and data centers scattered across globe in strategic locations which offers aforementioned services. To get access to these services and build cloud solutions using these services in Azure data centers, we need an Azure subscription. Azure subscription is an active agreement between end user and Microsoft, which gives user the needed access to provision resources in Microsoft Azure data centers, and in turn user is charged for a cloud-based resource consumption or a service license. Once the user has subscription, he can use various tools such as web-based portal or client-side command line, etc. to provision and manage these services. There are various types of Azure subscriptions depending on how we have procured the subscription and terms in agreement. On our screen, we can see various subscriptions, each identified by an offer ID. Simplest and quickest method of Azure subscription is Web Direct, in which case we directly sign up with Azure Online on azure.com and get billed monthly for Azure resources or credits. Example of such subscriptions are MSDN, Free Tier, etc. We can also sign up enterprise agreement with Microsoft Azure by making monetary commitments and gain access to custom pricing for Azure resources. In both of the above cases, we get complete access to subscription and we receive bill for resource consumption from Microsoft. We manage all the cloud IT deployed onto it and purchase support plan with Azure. Alternatively, we can also engage a partner for supporting and managing Azure resources. Lastly, we can also purchase the Azure subscription through Cloud Service Provider, which is a Microsoft designated Azure specialist company. In such case, we get billed for Azure usage from CSP. Also, we could opt for support and Azure Resource Management services from CSP. As we just discussed, Azure subscription grants us access to Microsoft Azure services. At this point, it is important to note that an Azure subscription has two aspects. First, the Azure account, through which resource usage is reported and services are billed. Second, the subscription itself, which governs access to and the use of Azure services that are subscribed to. When we sign up for Microsoft Azure, we create Azure account and Azure subscription based on one of the offers. Later on, as we grow on our Azure consumption, we can add one or more subscriptions within the same account, and thus we get architecture where Azure account has one or many subscriptions within it. Also, this architecture gives rise to two entities, account administrator and subscription owner. Account administrator receives the bill for the subscription within it. The subscription owner manages the IT implementation with Azure services, for example, virtual machines, SQL database, storage, etc., as per the IT requirement. For any IT implementation, it is common requirement to have an access control mechanism. For the same purpose, in Microsoft Azure, every subscription also has a trust relationship with an Azure AD instance. Azure AD stores the users, groups, and service principals within it. Azure subscription requires the Azure AD authentication and authorization for these users and groups before they perform any operation in Azure subscription. Note that a subscription only trusts one directory, but multiple subscriptions may trust the same Azure AD directory. Every Azure subscription is defined by 5 properties. First, directory. As we just discussed, subscription trusts a directory for user authentication and authorization. Second, offer and offer ID. That denotes offer ID selected while subscription provisioning. Third, subscription name. Subscription name is just an alias for subscription ID. Subscription name can be changed anytime and need not be unique. Fourth, subscription ID. Each subscription has a subscription ID which identifies it across all Azure consumers. Two customers can have the subscription with the same name but not with the same subscription ID. Fifth, status. Every subscription has a status value. For example, as shown on our screen, active. Other values of status can be cancelled, disabled, deactivated. For different types of subscriptions, there are different reasons for changing the status from cancelled to disabled. For example, for trial account or trial subscription or MSJ subscription types, if we exhaust the credit, our subscription status would be updated to disabled. Once the time period of subscription is over, our subscription status would change to cancelled. Similarly, for other types of subscription, there are different conditions and results. On the same line, if the subscription status is deactivated and if you want to again re-enable the subscription, there are different processes to be followed depending on the subscription type. However, in general processes, check if we have the option to reactivate the subscription in Azure Account Center. If not, next option is to contact support through Azure Support or through mail passing the details of the subscription. Now let's move on to define important characteristics of Azure subscription. Any Azure solution is shaped by 3 types of boundaries defined by Azure subscription. First is resource boundary. Azure subscription defines baseline what types of resources can be deployed and sets threshold on number of resources. Second is billing boundary. Azure subscription forms the billing point for the solutions. Resource consumption is aggregated and billed at subscription level. Third is management boundary. Azure provides various management features at subscription level. IT management in Azure would have Azure subscription as its controlling boundary. Let's discuss these 3 dimensions in details. Let's begin with resource boundary. By resource boundary, we mean Azure subscription can scope what can be provisioned, how many instances of service can be provisioned, and how it will be hosted or organized. Let's look into it one by one. Azure is based on API-defined architecture. Azure has a concept called resource provider. These resource providers are used for defining what types of Azure services can be provisioned within subscription. Resource providers need to be registered at subscription level for enabling the resource provisioning and management. On our screen, we can see various instances of resource provider. For example, Microsoft.compute, which enables virtual machine provisioning, Microsoft.devtestlabs, which enables DevTestLabs services. With the service provider registration status, the capability of end user solution can be controlled. Once we have resource provider enabled, we can use any tool such as PowerShell, command line interface, SDK to provision and manage Azure services. When we provision these services, the Azure subscription is set as a boundary for all the operations, services, and objects we create within it. Also, Azure subscription becomes the top level container and parent object for all the resources we deploy and manage within it. We need to at least have one subscription to begin provisioning operation, and this provisioning operation would deploy resources within Azure subscription. The last aspect of Azure subscription resource boundary is subscription threshold limits. Every subscription has the subscription threshold limits that sets the logical limit for how many resource instances can be provisioned. As shown on the screen, these threshold limits include soft, also known as default limits, and hard limits, also known as maximum limits. We can increase the capacity of the subscription up to the maximum limit by contacting Azure support. It is important to note that above mentioned limits are revised as capacity and capabilities are updated within Azure. And if we go by the historical trends, we can expect increase in limits with every revision. However, under existing scenario, if we have resource requirement that exceeds the maximum resource limits, then solution would be to go for multi-subscription architecture. In Azure, we get charged for resource consumption and license for services, if any. For granular comprehension of what gets built, this cost can be aggregated at resource group level and clubbed with resource tags. For the complete picture of resource consumption, all these billing units are rolled up to subscription and presented to user monthly in the form of invoice. Thus, a subscription forms the billing unit from the management perspective. These cumulated invoices can be viewed in Azure portal with subscription level authorization as shown on our screen, or can be viewed by account owner in Account Center, which we are going to study in account and subscription lecture. Once we have our environment provision, we need to perform various operations as per the business need. In Microsoft Azure, these operations are scoped at Azure subscription. Hence, Azure subscription is considered as management boundary. End user can use various tools such as PowerShell command and interface portal for managing the environment. These operations required a parameter subscription ID for execution, and operations are scoped within the subscription resource boundary. At this point, it is important to note that with recent updates to Azure platform, we can perform a limited set of cross-subscription operations, such as moving resources from one subscription to another. However, considering the percentage of such requirement, it is fair to assume Azure subscription as management operation boundary. Next important point to be understood in the context of management boundary is role-based access control and resource policy. Once we have our environment provision on Azure, Azure provides a governance framework in the form of RBAC and policies. For a very long time, these RBAC and policy operations were scoped at subscription level. However, with the new features such as management group, the scope of implementation for RBAC and policy has widened to multi-subscription. And if we observe the trend of features implemented by Azure, eventually Azure operations would start supporting multi-subscription operations, and thus Azure management can be scoped at multi-subscription level. However, considering current state of feature implementation, it is safe to assume the Azure management boundary at subscription level. I hope by now you have fair understanding of Azure subscription. For deeper understanding of the topic, do also check out the lecture for Azure account. Thanks for watching this lecture. See you on the other side.